All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the alumni thesis presentations by Polis. My name is Gary Gilson. I'm the secretary of Polis, and today with us we have Barbara Prezelj, who is a 2016 graduate from the landscape architecture track, and she's also the winner of the second prize in the Archiprix 2016 with her graduation project. So without wasting much time on my part, I give the floor to Barbara. She'll introduce you the project and also take you through a process and her journey for a graduation project. Barbara?
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, first, thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for joining in. I will share my screen now. I hope this works. Okay, here we go. So I was thinking a bit how to do this today and how to present my project, whether to present this as I usually did it or do it somehow differently. And I decided not to actually present in detail my project or my research, because if you want to, you can always read more about it afterwards by yourself. But I really want to focus on the process of my graduation and some of the choices that I made, how I picked the topic, and you have to realize it was 4 years ago. If I did it now, I would probably change some things, but I will just explain the things that I did back then. And then if you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer it later. Okay, this should, all right. So first of all, when you start with a project, you need a topic, some kind of a theme. Your mentors are probably going to speak about things like big fascination or an interest or a big question you should answer. It's good that if your project is relevant, that's definitely true. But I think the most important part is that you actually care about what you're doing, because it really shows if you believe in what you're doing. Whenever you're gonna talk about it or explain, people can tell that whether you're invested or not. And for me, it was also quite important to realize that what you're after doesn't necessarily have to be related with architecture or landscape. It's just your job to then relate it back to your field of study. But you have to make it exciting for yourself, because you're going to spend at least a year working on this thing. So it better be interesting. So knowing what you're doing and why you're doing it is very important in the beginning when you start. So for me, more than fascination, I think projects just started with frustration. And I spent, I think, up to my P2 just explaining what that frustration is and how I plan to deal with it. And it relates to what we now call disturbed sites. And I've been interested in these sites for quite a while throughout my studies, especially, and that's mainly because I see them as a kind of a landscape glitch, in a sense, that exposes what's going on underneath. And there are these places where human, non-human, nature culture divide somehow breaks down, and they're often regarded as having no or little value, because they contradict what we perceive as an image of the natural or the cultural, for that matter. So it began with these sites. And the way we commonly understand such sites is that at least landscape architecture predominantly focuses on improvement, which translates into immediate ecological remediation, introduction of new programs, something that's pleasurable, attractive. So basically we cover up all the mess that we done to the site. And we often speak about healing them or transforming them or bringing them back to life, bringing them some kind of stability and turn them into an image, I believe, of how nature should look like. So quite often there's no sign there of what was there before, or in many cases what's still there, but just hidden under the carpet. So in my understanding, that's wasted opportunity, at least at how I approach the sites in this project. And I think it's also, quite frankly, a bit of a hypocritical way of designing, because these sites are extremely complex, and just pretending that, you know, you can manage them completely and pretending that their effects can be completely contained or delimited is pretty far-fetched. But what they do is that they, I believe, reaffirm the same kind of worldview that views nature as a commodity and accepts this kind of places as an inevitable result of progress, growth, and what we sometimes call the good life. So that's how my project started. And I felt that this topic would be best explored if I was given a bit more of freedom to try out different things. So instead of fully graduating within Flowscape studio, I applied to join Explore Lab. So that meant that I still needed to take Flowscape's classes, but the graduation studio and research was part of Explore Lab. And as you can see, initially my team was the Uncanny in relation to disturbed sites, because at the time I was quite convinced that that's a combination that could offer an alternative to the current trend of post-industrial transformations by being perhaps slightly unpleasant and challenging, but quite powerful as an experience. And just to explain a bit, the uncanny is a psychological concept that was elaborated on by Freud. And it sort of signifies something that's sinister, unsettling, unhomely. It's when something that should remain hidden comes to light, or something that's frightening, but at the same time it's familiar. Freud's word for this was in German unheimlich, which means at the same time both homely and unhomely, something that seems kind of familiar, but at the same time it's strange and unfamiliar, and you don't know exactly where to put it. And you can imagine that very quickly this turns very dark. And when I was, the more and more that I was reading about it, the more I realized that it is not exactly what I was after. And that's maybe my second suggestion or advice to you, is that just read, and read a lot. You don't have much time, but just read, because whatever your topic is, there are people out there who have explored it before, and their ideas and their thinking can really challenge your own thinking, or at least like broaden your perspective. So you can see that perhaps you are mistaken, as I noticed fairly quickly. So then I realized that even Freud, like in one of the first sentences, mentioned what I was more looking to explore inside my own project, and that was a particular quality of feeling, something that breaks away from the routine or from business as usual, and something that makes you think. But that's not necessarily uncanny. Uncanny is just one such quality, but there are different ones. And then in September 2015, quite soon after the year started, I went to Iceland. And at the time, I wasn't sure whether I should go or not. It's your graduation year, you should be focused. But it was a fairly short trip. And I'm really glad I went, because Iceland, I've never been to Iceland before, but Iceland really taught me what landscape can do. I think Ronnie Horn once said that Iceland taught her how to taste experience, and now I sort of understand what that means, because in Iceland that's possible, because the nature of experience is so physical, it's very felt, it's very intense, and because that's an island that's constantly on the move, so it's very dynamic. And that was something that I really wanted to capture in my project. And also because I was thinking about the uncanny so much, it really made me aware um, also of the fact that Iceland is in a landscapey way kind of uncanny, because there are very basic familiar elements that combine in unfamiliar ways, and that brings about a certain previously unknown effect. So with that in mind, then I started thinking, what could uncanny mean in relation to landscape? So very fast, my main fascination then became, how could I basically recreate Iceland somewhere else? And that's what I mean when I speak about having like your own agenda. Like, of course, you need a research question that's relevant and relates to landscape architecture or urbanism or whatever, but you can have your own drive. So with that in mind, then I started thinking about how could landscape continuously reinvent itself, and that means working towards not just change, if we understand change as something quite predictable, like changing of the seasons or tide or rainfall patterns, but actual novelty, like something that wasn't there before and that couldn't be known in advance. Like that was my aim, how to work with something like that. So how to actually make a plan or think about design in such context. So I realized that I'm much more, well, I'm not so much interested in how landscapes move and transform or what's the visual outcome of that transformation, but more what moves them. So what are the processes that go into that, and what actually, like, how do they move? What activates them? So if you look at this, I like this image. These are snow rollers. So if you look at them, my aim became not as much how to create a fixed form, like a design of one of these rollers, for instance, but to create a set of potentials that could bring about this phenomena. So in this case, that would mean working with, I don't know, layers of snow, with temperature, humidity, surface textures, wind, and so on, much more than the end product. But of course, I also needed a site. And because I was so interested in disturbed sites, I had a few in mind even before I started working on the project. And I firstly heard about Fort de Vaujours, which became my site while reading an article in the New Yorker, I think. And this is an abandoned nuclear contaminated site and an area of planned gypsum extraction near Paris. It was changed a lot of times throughout history, and that's why I liked it, because it was so complex, and just the fact that it's still shrouded in secrecy, you can't really find much about it, was quite exciting for me. So as you can see, this is the center of the Paris, and then Fort de Vaujours is 25 kilometers northeast from Paris. And it was originally one of the forts that was built at the end of the 19th century to defend Paris. Then during the Second War, it was used as ammunition and explosives depot by the Germans. And then from 1955 to 97, it was used by CEA, that's France Alternative Energies and Atomic Energy Commission, and was used for pyrotechnic experiments, and was here where the core components of the country's first atomic bombs were developed. There were no full nuclear detonations at Vaujours, but more than half a ton of uranium was blown up in these explosions. And before they were moved indoors. They were taking place just outdoors around the site. So the whole site functioned as a kind of an open air lab. And after the research was closed in '97, the site was open for sale. CAA proposed it for sale. And in 2010, most of the area was bought by Placoplatre. Placoplatre is a local plaster company which plans now to demolish the fort and then excavate the whole area and make a new open pit gypsum mine, which is a key ingredient in plaster. So of course, then the mining proposal raised many questions about the safety of local inhabitants, because the digging and demolition, all of that lifts up particles that are otherwise fairly heavy, but it lifts them up and then spreads them around the area as toxic dust. So in 2014, 25 buildings were demolished, but the process was then interrupted because of radioactive risk. And then from 2015 on, the demolition continues. The site is closed off under constant surveillance, and mining was initially scheduled to begin this year, but now it's moved and it's being planned to begin in 2022. So this is how the site looked like at least 4 years ago. Now the area in front of the main fort is mainly blank, is demolished. And that was also what I took as sort of the beginning stage of my proposal. But because I took part in Explore Lab, and that's also why I decided to join it, is because I really enjoy research. And research is a big part of Explore Lab. So first you work on your research, theoretical research, and then you focus on design. Because I had all the courses to pass alongside research, I decided to sort of structure my research in a way that, yes, it will be a very in-depth theoretical study, but at the same time, I'm gonna propose some kind of analytical components that are gonna look at my site and analyze it. And then based on those components, throughout those components, I'm gonna learn some of the things that I need to then begin designing. So that looked something like this. In my theoretical research, I explored the concepts of the unfamiliar and territory. I'm not gonna delve deeper into that, but then one important bit that I wanna focus on is that I proposed the so-called learning through making research components. And they were meant as a kind of a key ingredient to bridge the gap between research and design. So they applied my theoretical findings on site, so for the Vaujours, and they were a kind of form of analysis that studied the site and that helped me move then towards design stage. It was quite important for me to keep track of my process, also for my mentors, because sometimes in Explore Lab, you're given much more freedom. And I think also if you're in your own home studio, it's important to think about what your project needs from a methodology perspective. It's often not great to just follow a tried and tested formula, because every project is different. So I sort of devised my own methodology, and it was important to then keep track of what each step is gonna do for my project. And because I believe that one thing sort of has to follow from another and needs to bring you closer to what you're trying to achieve. And then it helps that to sort of follow your steps, to also explain your process to your mentors. So for me, that meant at least this research through making components. I looked at the site through various diagrams. This stemmed from my theoretical research. but also they were really practical. So they really looked at the site and they really gave me like concrete things to think about. So for instance, I looked at how the site developed in time. So all the processes and all the actors that were involved from like 1800s to the present and their interaction. So this was sort of a site-wide. And then I focused on certain components on the site. So this, for instance, looked into how the area of the old gypsum quarry developed and all the processes that went into that and how long they were on site and so on. So all of that slowly brought me closer to design. And while doing that, I came to certain conclusions, like what my design should actually do and what it should be. So more than a fixed landscape plan, my aim was to design a kind of a blueprint or connections or choreography of processes and actors in space that could then bring about change in time. So not so it was almost like designing a framework for a game to then play out. I had these actors and processes, but then like you let it go at a certain moment. And that doesn't mean you don't come up with certain rules, but you just give a direction. You don't like prescribe it in advance. So what that meant that is that before even start putting things on a plan, I started sketching out a kind of scores. This meant that I listed like all kinds of processes on a timeline. And then I was thinking about, okay, if I relate this and this process, what can it happen and what do I want it to happen and when? So all of this different moments, then in different moments, different processes and different actors interact with one another to produce something new. So this kind of diagrams really help me understand how the site actually works. So what you can see here is on one side, different conditions that are met in certain period in time, and then what's the outcome of that. So whenever something happened, something on the site changed. And maybe like one way to explain this is, I took this video when I was doing experiments for my model, is you'll see there's a certain point where the threshold is reached and it's sort of a critical point when transformation occurs. And in this case, that's how much water plaster can take. So when it becomes saturated with water, you see, like suddenly you don't have the edge anymore. And those moments were what I was really interested in. Like, how can I encourage that or guide it? And to what extent should I even guide it? So one way of thinking about this that also helped me was Gilles Clément. You probably know him. He came up with this concept of jardin en mouvement, garden in movement. And what happened here is that he had this old apple tree in his garden, and suddenly one summer there was a big storm. The tree fell. And what he did is, because he's an experienced gardener as well, is that he said, okay, like with a bit of help, a bit of direction, this tree can grow, but not in a way I envisioned it, but somehow differently. And in my view, that's really what a resilient landscape means, like a place that constantly reinvents itself. And in a way, that's what I wanted to achieve. Like here, this is done on a small garden scale, but I was thinking, how could you translate this kind of thinking to the scale of the landscape? And then, of course, because I was thinking of all kind of connections and processes, I was a bit reluctant to even start drawing a plan, because once you put a circle on a drawing, you know that's going to be a tree. So it was sort of an easy step for me to just start drawing what's there. So I drew the site as it was before they started demolishing anything. And I drew the site while they were demolishing, so some of the buildings were still there. And then I came to sort of the blank site. And for me, plan is a kind of behavior, a landscape behavior. So it's like relationship put in a diagrammatic form. And here I got a bit struck because I was again thinking like it's a, you know, a blank piece of paper. What can you do? Like everything's possible. So I went back to my charts, my relationships, uh, and I said, okay, I'm gonna set certain periods in time, and these periods in time were determined certain time frames, like how long does it take for them to mine the site, how long does it take for the ceiling of the quarry to drop, and so on. So I came up with 8 different periods in the time scale of 300 years. And then I started putting down like site conditions, which conditions are going to be met in those years, and then what should happen on site, or what happens as a consequence of those conditions met. And these were eight moments in time. Uh, and then I decided, okay, I'm gonna draw a plan based on those 8 moments. So here then you can see how I drew a plan for each of those 8 years and how the site should develop. But it still bothered me that this looked too much like a master plan. And I precisely did not want a master plan. Because in a way I wanted to appear as if it's permanently unfinished. And this to me, even this like seemed too fixed. Like, yes, I'm giving direction, but still, like I say, this is kind of gonna happen in 8 years time. But of course, like maybe they won't start mining. Maybe, I don't know, something else will happen. So I decided to come up with yet another 4 scenarios for each of these 8 years. So in the end, I came up with 32 different plans that I decided to draw in an axonometric view, just because I wanted to give a bit more of a spatial feel to the drawing, as if you could explore the site a bit better. So yeah, here I just included one snapshot of that and a bit more detailed, because I wanted to speak a bit about precision as well, because I think a lot of times what you can nowadays observe is that projects that deal with topics that I dealt with, such as flows, networks, openness, they often remain quite vague, quite formless, and they argue that nature will kind of speak for itself. And I really disagree with that. And I really wanted to be precise, like crazy precise, because I do believe that at the end of the day, like processes and relationships, like they need an expression and a form to play out. And also, I believe like open-ended features can really only be achieved through precise definition. It's just the task is then to discover the right amount of control and when something shifts. Because in order to remain open and like for the site to keep on changing, you need to keep differences alive. So you need to do something. Because here in my case, on my site, if I didn't do anything and just said, okay, I'm going to leave it open, let's see what happens, pretty soon my site would turn into a climax beach forest. And that's, I mean, it's a forest that's going to stay there for a while if natural disaster doesn't happen. But because I really wanted this to be an active site, I needed to like edit a certain amount of control, but then work with these moments when everything would suddenly shift. So when I was drawing this in precision, as you can see, it's a lot of was quite a lot of work, but it also made me aware like how landscape land actually develops. It was a lot of trace over trace, how forests would develop, how clearings would disappear, and so on. It was also important for me that this kind of thinking goes through scales. And I was thinking primarily about 3 main scales. So I had the scale of the site, And here you can see then a couple of these drawings put together of like how the site could potentially develop in time based on this what I called markers in my research as well. So that's the wider site scale. Along with this, I also made a diagram of different networks and how this site would actually perform in time, like what are the different habitats that would develop, different floral, faunal connections, and so on. This is just a section of that. And then I came to the scale of the built element. These are all the built elements that I proposed on my site, but it's important to understand that this is like a fictional scenario. None of this would be on site at the same moment, but just for clarification, I included all of them on the same diagram. And if we focus on one of them, this is the main gardener shed. I then explain how this would work in plan, in section, and then in an axonometry. But then of course also because the built elements themselves would reflect the development of the site through time, I included this kind of small diagrams that explain how each element would develop, and how like the building block, which in my case was a gabion wall that got filled with different things depending on the development of the site, how this plays like part of the story as well. And the smaller scale in a way was the scale of the body. So how do you actually experience this design? This was my version of what we would normally call a perspective drawing, but I really wanted, and I think, well, I always strived to make my drawings appear in a way they take on the quality of the project. So in a way they tell at least part of the story of the whole project. So here I really wanted the view as like landscape, as like a framed view, to have a kind of a fleeting quality, as if what you see is very temporary and it's very unstable, and it might not even be there. So it's hard to see this on an image like this, but this was a foam board, and then all of these different pieces are carved out of paper, thicker paper, and it's also almost like a collage, and then they're pinned on, so they're very fragile. Everything is pinned on, and the background is just, you know, like a terrain meshwork. And another part that focused on the bodies that my project were gardeners, because gardeners were the ones who then take on the development on the site, and they work on the ground and directly interact with landscape. They are also the ones who propose the direction and let things evolve and then react over and over again through time. So I made a report for them where I really precisely put down what their tasks were per month, and this is their uniform because it's a nuclear contaminated site. There was sort of a time frame, how long they can stay in, how that works, how they meet each other. It's strangely related to a current pandemic. But yeah, so this was also for me a bit of a challenge to really think about how could you manage this site in the long term. And I want to speak briefly about two things, model and my P5, because for the model I had the same thoughts, like why would I model this, because it can change. I want it to change any minute. And this was sort of the drawing that I got from the map room. But as you can see, I didn't want to cut it out. I would need to spend like hours fixing this contour lines. They're not perfect. So I said, okay, one thing I do know is that there's kinetic sand. I don't know if you know kinetic sand, but it's this great sand that you can shape and form, and it's quite solid once it stays together, but then it also quite quickly can be deformed and transformed into something else. So I modeled my whole site out of this sand, and quite quickly I realized it just looked terrible. I mean, it was very convenient and very convenient to shape, but it just didn't do what I wanted it to do. And that because I wanted to, the main thing about my project is change. So I wanted to really show how different processes change the site, and having kinetic sand that there and me like modeling it just didn't like cut it for me. So then I thought, okay, then I'm just gonna really focus on a section of the site and make like a detail model that's gonna show, in this case, how underground quarry is through time, through 300 years time, gonna drop, and there's gonna be a huge cave down there. So I wanted to model this, and I came up with kind of a structure that I would build this thing out of plaster and sand and salt, and then I would hang bottles with hot water on top, and this would drip, and in time this would give an impression as if erosion happened, as if the ceiling dropped. So in my well, this was sort of the perfect scenario. What I wanted to achieve, sort of this man-made structures that signal just human presence and connections and so on would still be there, but everything else would transform into a completely different landscape that wouldn't prioritize human experience necessarily. So I built this model. I made some kind of foam structure to put it on top so that the water could then move through it. I had it there on my desk for 2 weeks with a kettle while I was drawing things in CAD, and it was just kind of a nice thing to have, like a bit more tactile and a bit something that you could, yeah, I don't know, interact with. And of course, it took me 2 weeks to come to this, so it would take much, much longer for it to actually collapse, and the proportions weren't right and so on. But I did think that in the end it was quite successful, because it did show what I wanted it to show, and that was like my main aim when I started thinking about a model. So even though it wasn't the prettiest and it didn't show the whole site, it showed like one section of it pretty well, I think. And then for my P5 and for all my Ps, because I was quite interested in materiality of things and tactility of landscape, I have throughout the year avoided presentations on the screen. So actually making this presentation was my first presentation putting drawings on the screen, because I always wanted to have paper and something that people could hold in their hands or like came close and discuss. So I then decided to also transform my P5 presentation into a kind of an exhibition room. So I put all my thoughts and all my findings on paper. I created the 6 booklets. 2 of them were my research findings. There were 2 parts of the report, the actual report, and then the gardener's manual. There was the story of the site and herbarium, because when I went to the site, I picked different samples. So I made a herbarium and then scanned that. It was a lot of paper. I just printed it at school. It worked just fine. And then, yeah, and then this was my P5. It was, I really tried to get the most out of the room that I was given. So some things worked great, some things didn't work as well. For instance, I wanted, when you see those plastic sheets, those are 8 different plants printed on plastic sheets, one behind another. And I wanted to create this effect that you could see through and see the change throughout the years, but that completely failed. You can't see that. But some other things really worked well. So I think maybe the one last thing that I would say is that I don't know if it's the same system now, but for me, like the P4 was the big, like scary one. And then for P5, you're given much more freedom and you're also a bit more relaxed. And I think I would just encourage people to think about what kind of P5 would best represent their project. And it usually pays off to just experiment a little. Okay, I think this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara. In fact, a really daring approach to do a thesis like this, and it's completely unconventional. I mean, I've never seen a project that is done in this way, super customized for the specific site and specific interest, and a lot of
Yeah.
lot of hands-on experimentation and materiality involved. Really inspiring for me. I hope it is inspiring for the others as well. And maybe now we can go into some questions if somebody has something to ask. Questions, guys, you can type in the chat box, or you can ask directly. Anyone? Jan, what do you think? No,
No questions.
no questions. Okay, maybe I can ask you something. It's
Yeah.
about uh, when you do things like this. Have you ever thought about this? What if it goes wrong? What if things like this goes wrong? You know, because this is a really important year for you, and you have to finish the whole graduation in a year. And if you're experimenting with things, if you're making 32 plans, and what if that is not the right way to do? What if you fail? Have you ever thought of approaching a project like that?
Yeah, I mean, I knew that I had to, even though I was experimenting, and even though in my head, you know, when you, especially when you're doing research and you read all of these things, you're really inside your own head. So in my head, it made sense, but it really helps if you talk with your mentors and your fellow students, and just try to explain it to them. And I think if they find something that they can relate to and something that's interesting, that's also already a good sign. But then, of course, I mean, for me, the most challenging part was just time management, basically. You know, at a certain point, I had like 32 plans to draw, um, and yeah, like being just convinced also in your steps, it's quite good, I think. Like as long as you know what you're after and you really know what this drawing is going to do, then like you can also tell at the end whether it was successful or not. um, and that was for me quite important. I had a few um, like moments where like something just didn't work, so then I had to change it. and and also because I spent all this time doing research, and my research was quite a substantial document, then initially my mentor said, well, you know what, we actually think this is fine. Like if you want to graduate with this, we're happy for you to graduate. But I really wanted to bring my research into a practice or onto a real site. And that was my biggest fear, maybe, that would fail, that like my research, what I discovered just through reading and writing things, wouldn't be as successful once you apply it to like real world problems. And yeah, there's always that risk that you're gonna fail, but I think I learned so much like just doing it. I don't know, I think it's worth it just for the sake of it to try something else.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? Questions? I don't think we have more questions for now.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a message from Sushin. Maybe you can ask it yourself, Susi.
Okay. Thanks, Barbara, for your very interesting presentation.
Okay.
I'm also curious about your PhD studies in Edinburgh. Like, how would you like? Can you share with us how you decided on this path?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I think I mentioned before that I'm very interested in research, and when I've never really done much research before coming to Delft to do my master's studies. And then for my electives in the last quarter, I picked architecture theory studio, and there that sort of introduced me to maybe a bit of a different kind of thinking. That's a bit more abstract, a bit more theoretical, and I really enjoy that because it expanded like my view on things. And then I graduated, and it was I spent a year and a half working on this project, so I extended it for a couple of months. I graduated in November, and it's kind of an all-consuming thing. So going straight into PhD study just wasn't feasible. Also because you need a well-founded topic. You need something that you're going to spend at least 3 years on. You also need quite a sum of money, and I had like none of that. So I first I was invited to then be a guest teacher for architecture theory thesis course, and I really enjoyed that. And then I just said, okay, well, I need to save up some money if I want to eventually go into academia. So I moved to London. I was working in a landscape architecture office for 2 years. And then when I had some money saved so I could quit for a while to write my PhD proposal, I said, okay, well, now it's the time, because also, once you're away from school for a while, you practice is very different, and different questions, and you're not used anymore to just sit down and read and write. So I really wanted to not to do that in a way. So I took the time this year and just wrote my proposal, and then luckily got accepted. But I think for me it was always this, just that I really enjoyed teaching and reading about theory. That was my, yeah.
Thank you for sharing, and also congratulations to you.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you, Susie, for the question as well. Another question?
Thanks for your presentation. And I have this kind of question to ask, because when every time I'm doing my R&D studio work in Q2 or Q3 or 4, I was always wondering, okay, what's the biggest difference between normal R&D studio work and the final graduation project? Maybe the depth of the project, or the depth of methodology, the completely I'm always wondering this kind of thing.
So you mean the final graduation project and your studio that was now in the first year, for instance?
Yeah, I know they're different, but I was always wondering, can you tell us what's the main challenge to you?
Well, for me, it was just that I really wanted to work on something that also in a way represents how I approach landscape architecture. So figuring out like what's your take on landscape, and where do you stand, and what do you want to do after, was for me quite important. And then based on that, you pick your project, your questions, your site, and you really explore it. So I think that's what I mean when I say something like be really interested in what you're doing, because you have a year to work on this thing, and you get so much more in depth. And maybe what's also different is that there's less contact between people and between you and your mentors, so you're way more independent, and you have to kind of come up with a plan that's going to make sense, and that's going to bring you first to, I don't know, P1, P2, P3, P4, and so on. And you have to, for yourself, know those deadlines and know like when you should do certain thing. So it's much more, I think it challenges you a bit more as a designer, and also as someone who manages projects.
Okay, thank you. So main challenge might be personal, individual perspective, your interest, and also the
Yes,
independence on the project.
independence, and then just dedication and like doing it, you know.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for the question. Do we have more questions? I think that's it for now, and we are on time. So thank you so much, Barbara, for
Yeah,
accepting our
thank you.
invitation. And it was indeed a very inspiring project to step out of your comfort zone and experiment with your own passion and finding a project that suits you. And of course, about your, it's inspiring to hear you hear the stories about how you went on to your PhD and how you took on from your studies from TU Delft as well. It's always nice to hear from alumni like you. So thanks once again, and I also wish from my part and on behalf of the entire Paulus board the best wishes for your PhD.
Thank you very much. I wish you a good year. Don't be too worried. It's all gonna be fine, but just like get the most out of it. It's, I think, very exciting. I learned a lot, and yeah, just enjoy it.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.